It always, oh, there it goes. Okay, usually it takes a couple seconds. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session on analyzing primary sources. My name is, I've got slides, hang on. My name is Janie Adams, and I'm the Curator of Education for the Arizona Historical Society. I'm also the Arizona Affiliate National History Day Coordinator, and today I am joined by Allison Avery, who is the Curator of Education also for the Historical Society and is the regional Central Arizona Regional Coordinator. And we're so excited to have you with us today. So we've got a lot of ground to cover because primary sources are, that's it. That's the historian's bread and butter. Primary sources are it. And I know that a lot of students really struggle with how to actually analyze a primary source. So today I'm just going to suggest a lot of different methods, ask a lot of leading questions that you can ask yourself when you're approaching a bunch of different kinds of primary sources. And we really took a shotgun approach here and just picked a ton of different sources. But if there's something that you have a specific question about, you can put it in the chat or you can send us an email, nhdaz@azhs.gov. Okay, so primary source analysis. Why? History is about interpretation, right? History is not about facts and dates and figures. It's about interpretation. So we analyze primary sources in order to get to the bottom of a historical problem that's related to our working thesis that we've already drafted. So every argument is unique because you are unique and have a unique perspective. So you have to analyze your primary sources using your unique view of the past. Another word for perspective is bias. And I've said this a million times. Bias is not inherently bad, but it is important to acknowledge your unique perspective and how your unique perspective can change the way that you think about things. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell why we even do primary source analysis. So let's jump into some specific strategies for different kinds of primary sources. So we're going to start with documents. Documents are a historian's bread and butter. They are the core of what we are doing. So whether you are reading for surface level information or you're reading against the grain for marginalized voices, documents are one of the most traditional ways that Westerners record the past. Westerners is a really important caveat there, and we'll talk about some ways that non-Western people have recorded the past and how we can access that information. So this is a mnemonic device that you can use to help you when you are analyzing primary sources. This one works really well for documents, but you can also kind of apply the same thought process to any primary source. So it's acclimate, right? Author, content, context, language, intent, meaning, audience, time, and evaluation. So I want to walk through these a little bit. So author, who wrote the source? What is the author's background? And is that relevant to understanding the source? Content, what does the source actually say? What's actually in the primary source? So just read for super objective, surface level information. What is it trying to tell you? Context, what else is happening around the same time that this source was written or created that may have shaped the creation of this source? Language, right? So not only just thinking about different kinds of languages, but also the language within the text, right? So what kind of words are used? Are they formal? Are they informal? Is it technical? Is it accessible? Is it polite? Is it confrontational? So think about how you would describe the language within the piece. And then you want to think about intent. Why was the source written? What was the goal or purpose, right? Is this personal correspondence? Is this a persuasive letter? Is this an advertisement? Those are all different kinds of intent. Meaning, what deeper or possibly even unacknowledged cultural assumptions, values, and ideas are revealed within the source? So that one's going to require you to really lean hard on your context and understand the context in which your source was created. And then you can understand the meaning. So you'll be looking for things like stereotypes. You'll be looking for things like bias. You'll be looking for things like specific words that are used to describe certain groups of people or certain individuals. Those are all related to that meaning question. Audience. Who was the source written for? And how might that have affected what was written? And we'll cover that in a little bit of details, but you want to think about who is the audience for the source. Was this source ever intended to be read by a large public audience? Time. Is there any time gap between the experience or events discussed in the source and the writing down of those ideas? So something can still be a primary source if it was created 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years after the fact. It still can be a primary source. We just have to be really mindful that time and memory shift and they change the meaning, right? So historical significance changes over time. And how can we use this time gap in a source to understand how historical significance changes? And then finally, evaluation. This is where you come in as the historian. Are there any significant biases that we should take into account? And is there any reason to doubt the credibility of the source? Right? So that's where you'll be putting on your historian hat and going, oh, this person is in the out group. Do they have the right to say this about these people? Something like that. So acclimate. If you're watching at home, scribble this down. If you're watching a recording later, write this down. This is really helpful when you're just learning how to analyze a primary source. Okay, so different types of documents, non-exhaustive list. So documents is a really, really huge category. And so these are just some ideas of the different kinds of documents that exist. So newspapers is a really obvious one, but a little caveat for newspapers, see if you can track down who owned the newspaper at the time that you're looking at it. So what is their editorial lens? What is their political affiliation? And how does that shape what is published in the paper? A really good example is a lot of the newspapers in Arizona were owned by mining companies. So if there's a labor conflict within the mine, do you think that the newspaper is siding on the side of the striking miners or on the side of the mining company? You can learn that information by understanding who actually owns the newspaper. Then we've got business records as a kind of document, city or business directories, surveys. Now, it's important to remember that when you're looking at a survey, to remember polling bias. Polling bias is this idea that you intentionally select your pollees to sway the answer and to make the answer look like a certain thing. So you want to make sure that you read the survey questions and you think about who was surveyed. And then ask yourself, is this a fair representation of whatever population they're trying to make this generalization about? Another kind of document is a transcript. So either a school transcript or a transcript of an interview, lots of different kinds of transcripts. Diaries. An important question to ask when thinking about diaries is, do you think this person would have ever imagined that their diary was of historical significance? And then letters. Is a letter professional or is it personal? And how does that change potentially what is written? So some things are written with the idea that they will last forever, like contracts, like treaties, like laws, things like that. Other things are meant to be thrown away eventually. So think a telegram, a birthday card, things like that. So when you're thinking about the author and thinking about the recipient of a document, think about why something was created and to serve what purpose. And it's really tempting to assume the emotional state of someone when they keep a certain document or throw a certain document out, but you don't want to rush to that conclusion. We really want to make sure that we're not imposing our kind of present day emotions on people from the past, unless they're explicitly telling you that they felt a certain way about a letter or a law or something. So try to see if you can piece their emotional state together through your research. Don't just assume. Okay. Things like diaries, journals, personal letters, they are really different from intentionally public-facing documents. So when you're reading someone's diary or you're reading a collection of letters, you want to think to yourself, how might the thought that no one will ever read what you have written shape what you write? right? So I've included this tweet here. And it's got a picture from a book, and it says here, in 1887, Helene was engaged to a man who then broke up with her by letter. Distraught, she asked her friends to destroy any correspondence in which his name appeared, and they were so efficient that we, present day viewers, have no idea who this man was. So remember that diaries and letters and things that are really personal can easily be shaped, right? If I know that my mom is reading my diary, maybe I'm not going to write down all my deepest, darkest secrets. Maybe I have a second diary, right? So it's important to keep that kind of stuff in mind when you're looking at personal records. All right, speaking of diaries, the many version of Anne Frank's diary. So Anne Frank's diary is probably one of the best known diaries in the world. But did you know that there are actually several versions of the diary? The first published version was published by Anne's father, and Otto Frank edited Anne's diary and removed passages about her depression and her sexuality and issues that she was having within the family. And then subsequent versions of the diary have been published, but they include those parts that were edited out. So historians have to determine for themselves, is there a better version of this source material? Now that we know that it's been edited, does that change the purpose or the intent of a primary source, right? How does Otto Frank editing the diary change Anne's worldview? How does that change her experience and the way that we come to know her experience? So it's important to remember that when you're looking at sources, you want to make sure that you're finding the least edited primary source possible. Not always going to be the case, right? Things are redacted, things are expunged, documents are destroyed. It happens. So always just remember that if you're looking at an edited source, someone intentionally is trying to change the narrative for whatever reason. Sometimes it's a malicious reason. Sometimes it's to protect family legacy or to protect someone's memory and honor someone. So editing is not always done maliciously. It's just important to kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so you heard me say earlier something about reading against the grain. And you'll hear historians say that a lot. But what does that even mean? So historians read against the grain to look for missing voices and perspectives of marginalized people within an established historical narrative. So when you read a primary source document and you're just kind of absorbing the information, you're reading with the grain. When you reread that document and then you start asking yourself probing questions like, where is this group's voice, or why does this group get to speak for this group? That's you reading against the grain. It's important to remember that knowledge is created and that knowledge has power. So reading against the grain is a way to redistribute that historical power, the power of being included in the historical narrative. So I think that a lot of people, when they look at history and they look at kind of the mainstream narrative of history, they become frustrated because it seems like so many voices are missing from the narrative. The voices of Black, Indigenous people of color, women, LGBTQIA people, immigrants, working class people, members of religious minorities, so many different groups seem like they're excluded from the dominant narrative. And they are, but they're not missing. Their voices aren't missing. Their voices have been intentionally silenced. So how do we read against the grain and listen for those silences? How do we take a document that represents kind of the mainstream historical narrative and read it against the grain and interrogate that document to look for marginalized people? Now, I say this because if you're looking for stories of certain groups and you can't find them, you're struggling, you're really frustrated, don't get discouraged. It's just a matter of finding a new way to look for some of those sources. So remember how we said that documents are really kind of the bread and butter of Western historians and Western record keeping? So now we're going to look at some other kinds of primary sources that might be more illuminating for marginalized groups beyond documents. And if you're following along at home and you're completing your roadmap, the secret code word for this workshop is SHOLO. Remember that you have until December 1st to complete your roadmap and email it to nhdaz@azhs.gov. And if you do so, we will give you a little treat at the State National History Day contest. This is for National History Day in Arizona students. So we're really looking forward to seeing you at the contest. Okay, so now we're going to move from documents to images. And we're going to start with maps. So maps are the kind of primary source that bridge the gap between documents and images. And maps can tell us so much about common assumptions and ideas of the time. And they can tell us so much more about the map maker and who they are and the context in which they live. Then they can tell us about geography sometimes. And here's an example of what I mean by that. So this is a map from the 1930s of Arizona. Notice that this isn't a particularly helpful map if you're trying to drive a car or ride your horse across the state. There really isn't a sense of how to get anywhere. So this map was definitely made for the tourist trade, right? It was kind of a tchotchke that you could keep. But I wanted to draw your attention to the caricatures on this map. So if we look at for example, this section where it says Papago Indian Reservation. So in the 80s, the Tohono O'odham formally changed their name, but when this map was created, they were called the Papago. So if we look at this drawing, right, we see kind of a racist caricature of an indigenous man. And then if we look at, say, the drawing of Tucson, we see caricatures of University of Arizona students. Notice how this student is both male and white. And we also see a caricature of an older man, an older white man kind of relaxing against a palm tree, right? So this map is really telling us much more about the 1930s and about the company who produced this map than it's actually telling us about the geography of Arizona. So that's one way to read a map to try to get more information. Okay, so maps, and now onto photographs. So we like to think of photographs as the perfect primary source, right? It's an instantaneous moment in time. It perfectly preserves a historical moment. But that's really not the case, right? We know that old technology for photography took time to actually produce the photograph, to actually emboss the film. And then now we know that there's Photoshops and there are deep fakes and all kinds of things like that. So photographs can easily be manipulated, and not just kind of manipulated after the fact, but manipulated at the time that the photograph is being taken. So it's really important to remember that photos also have bias. When you're looking at a photo, try not to rush to subjective conclusions. You want to make a list of objective observations first. Who or what is the subject? How is the subject arranged? When was the photo taken? Is it a black and white photo? Is it a color photo? What are the people wearing? What are they doing? Stuff like that. Just make a list of all your objective observations. And then you want to think about the photographer as the author of the image. What bias is that photographer bringing to the table? How are they depicting individuals or places? Think about who is the intended audience for that photograph. Was this photo taken for someone's family vacation? Was this photo taken at a party and someone thought it would never see the light of day? Or was this photo taken for the front page of the newspaper? All of those audiences change the way that the photo is created and change the photo's meaning. And then finally, once you've done all that, you want to think about the historical context. What is happening around this photo and why is it important? And once you introduce that historical context into your subjective observations, you can start to make, I think I got that backwards. When you start to add the historical context to your objective observations of the photograph, all of those kind of concrete details of the photograph, then you can start coming to subjective conclusions. You can think about, well, what does it mean that this person is seated and this person is standing? What does it mean that all of the women are on this side of the photograph and all of the men are on this side of the photograph? Then you can start to analyze the photograph. So here's a really good example of photography that has bias, or the bias that potentially exists in photography. So this is a very, very, very famous photograph of Abraham Lincoln. Actually, no, it's not. This is a photoshopped, an 1860s Photoshop. This is a photoshopped photo of John C. Calhoun. Abraham Lincoln was considered at the time to be unfortunately ugly. And his kind of political handlers at the time were concerned that his grave ugliness, which is incredibly rude, but American politics have always, to a certain extent, been about looks. So his political handlers were very concerned that Abraham Lincoln was so ugly he would never be elected president. And so they took a lot of photographs of men that they thought were more attractive and superimposed Abraham Lincoln's head on them. And it's actually a really funny story about this photograph. Not only have they superimposed Abraham Lincoln's head on Calhoun's body, they've also changed the text on the globe and on the table that the two men are leaning on. And people realized not too long after this photo was published that it was a fake, because Abraham Lincoln's really famous mole is on the wrong side of his face because they didn't flip the image correctly. So just goes to show you that photography can easily be doctored and easily be changed to fit a certain historical narrative. And this is just a really concrete example of that. Okay, so analyzing comics or political cartoons. Comics and political cartoons are a great way to look into the humor of the past. Humor is really illuminating, but comics are not just a fun element that you can add to your project. They require just as much analysis as any newspaper article. So you can't just like throw a picture in your paper and call it done. You have to analyze it. So do your research not only on the historical context surrounding kind of the event that the cartoon is satirizing, but also about the publication who produced it. So what are their political values? Who is their editor? Things like that. Same kind of thing that you would do when you're researching news. And then you want to spend some time researching the artist if you can track them down. Is this comic in line with their work? What are their political opinions? You know, are they always drawing their opinion, or sometimes can they be swayed by a paycheck? And then you want to think about style, right? Are the drawings literal or are they symbolic? How is caricature used? What does that caricature or that symbology reveal about widespread stereotypes or biases of the time? So this is a super, super famous political cartoon that you all have probably seen from Puck magazine. It's called Great Powers Divide China. And you can see that all of the different great powers, the vast majority of them being European powers, are caricaturized as animals. They're anthropomorphized. And they're kind of aggressively standing over China. So you can see here that it really kind of draws to a conclusion this conflict over the division of China. What's really important to recognize is that this was published in Puck magazine. So Puck magazine is America's first kind of humor satire magazine. It was actually originally published in German, and then started to have English editions. But Puck is, I think, still producing and still very much famous for political cartoons and political satire. So it's just as important that you research the magazine and the artist and then get into what the comic is actually trying to tell you. Okay, analyzing art. So fine art or high art, particularly in the modern and postmodern periods, can be really difficult to analyze. The postmodern and modern periods are really marked by a rejection of realistic representations of life, right? Once the camera is introduced into the art world, artists go, there is no reason for me to paint hyper realistic paintings anymore because we have photography. So I'm going to express myself in a different way. And then you have Impressionism, different expressionist movements, and so on and so forth. Art really, really changes after the introduction of the camera. So analyzing high or fine art can be difficult because not only are you situating that piece within its historical context, but you need to have all of these other different analytical tools called the elements of art, which are picture plane, so how things are, how the picture is organized. And then you have composition, you have color, the use of color. Are they muted colors? Are they acidic colors? Are they highly saturated colors? You have line, shape, contrast, texture, technique. So is it like a hyper realistic painting? Is it something more expressive? And then you have illusionistic space. So are you being drawn into the painting? Is the painting pushing you out? Is there some kind of foreshortening that creates an optical illusion? So if you're interested in analyzing art in particular, I would really do some research on the elements of art. And if you're really struggling with the elements of art, reach out, send us an email. We'll help you get some ideas for how to do art historical analysis. But I wanted to show you this. Oh, not quite yet. So it's important to remember that the artist is like the author. And so you need to research the artist and understand who they are and why they created this piece, what was going on in their life when they created this piece. And then also think about their patron. Probably before the camera, really. So before a certain point in history, all artists had a patron. And art would not get produced unless a patron paid for it, right? So there's your audience there. So is this a public art, right? Is this patron designing art for something like the Sistine, or paying for art for something like the Sistine Chapel, where people are supposed to come in and adore it publicly? Or was this intended for private use? A lot of kind of scandalous paintings, scandalous artworks were intended for private use and would never have been shown to the public. So it's important to remember the patron and the artist when you're also thinking about the artwork. So now let's talk about the artwork. Okay, so this is a painting by Max Ernst from 1921. And what's really important about this painting is the time period. So 1921, people are really just coming to grips with the horrors of World War I. World War I changed everything. Everyone struggled with the aftermath of World War I because World War I to a lot of people was just senseless carnage. And so the art scene began to reject rationality. And then you see surrealists, you see the Dadists, the Cubists, the primitivists, all of them coming out in this time period after the First World War. So this painting is in that kind of family of paintings, in a kind of reaction to the First World War. You see a desolate, kind of decimated landscape, lots of gray, kind of a depressed color tone. You see this shape in the center that at both times looks like an animal and also like a machine. Thinking about industrialization, thinking about the industrialization of war. And then you have this female figure that's kind of pushed rather helplessly to the very fore of the painting and kind of is being forced by this elephant tank in towards the audience. So all of those things you can only really understand if you understand that this is happening right after World War I, and people are still kind of coming to grips with what it means to have had a world war. So context is super, 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 super important for understanding art. And as always, you want to make sure that you cite the original source. All images have an original source, and spend some time tracking it down. Don't just cite some random blog or article. trace the image back to the archive, library, museum, collection, whomever owns it. If you need help doing that, we did a pretty thorough demo of how to do that in the Navigating the Archives workshop, and you can find that on the NHDAZ website. All right, changing gears a little bit. Analyzing three-dimensional objects. So three-dimensional objects, I think, are often overlooked in historical research, but 3D objects have their own histories that have deep meaning. Because not only do we understand historical events and their usage in historical events, we understand historical impact of those events. So when analyzing a 3D object, you want to take some time to make notes about the physical form and description of the piece, the color, the texture, the size, the materials, the weight. The form of a piece might help you understand how it had been used. So a really good example is if you're looking at a piece of pottery and it has a skinny neck and a skinny opening, right? What kinds of things are you going to store in there? Probably water, probably something that flows easy. But if you have a piece of pottery that has a lid, you're probably going to store something in it like flour or grain. So the form of a piece can really help us understand what it was used for, and that can help us understand the historical context of the piece. So here's an example of a 3D object. So this is a photograph, but I want to draw our attention to the dress. So this is Charlotte Hall, and Charlotte Hall is wearing this copper dress. So Charlotte Hall was Arizona's first, I think she was the territorial historian, one of the first women ever in territorial governments, and one of the first women to ever represent a state or territory in Washington, D.C. And so she got called for this kind of fancy dinner in D.C. and decided to have this copper dress commissioned. So remember, it's the 1920s. Copper is king. Copper is so highly sought after, not only because it's a great conductor of electricity, but also because it's used in the manufacturing of bullets. And Arizona at the time was one of the largest producers of copper in the world. So this was a very intentional choice on Charlotte's part to wear this copper dress to this big fancy dinner to show the richness and the value that Arizona brings as a state. So it's really important to think about the dress as a three-dimensional object and understand how to analyze the dress within historical context. And you can do that with any three-dimensional object, a dress, a toy, a weapon, anything like that. All right, analyzing music. Music, like art or poetry, is an encapsulation of emotion during a particular historical moment. And so some songs are very obviously connected to historical events, but others require you to do a little bit of creative problem solving to see how the pieces fit together. So you want to analyze the lyrics to that song like it was a document and then place the song in its historical context. You also want to think about how is this historical context contextualized by other historical contexts, right? So then think about the music itself. Is it reminiscent of a different style? Is it reminiscent of a different song? How are those pieces in conversation? What is it trying to tell us by using this soundbite or this song? Think about sampling. Like when rap artists do sampling in a song, they're hearkening back to another artist's song. And that's a very intentional choice. Why are they doing that? So here are some examples that I pulled. One, very obvious, James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, very obviously connected to the struggle for Black freedom. Dancing in the Street, however, is a protest song from the struggle for Black freedom, but not as outwardly and not as in your face as the James Brown song. But the Dancing in the Street song is really about kind of Black joy and Black exuberance in a time when the larger mainstream population does not want Black people to feel any joy or any exuberance. So it's important to think about these two pieces as primary sources for a particular historical event. And if you're interested in learning more about how music shaped the struggle for Black freedom, or interested in learning some methods for how to understand music as historical evidence, you want to check out this podcast. So if you have Spotify, you can actually just open up your Spotify app, and in the search bar, there's like a little camera icon, and you can just kind of point that at this link and it'll take you there. If you don't have Spotify, this is season 3, episode 3 of the Learning for Justice Teaching Hard History podcast. And it's about music and the civil rights movement. And there are some really kind of compelling arguments for interpreting music as a primary source to understand the struggle for Black freedom. All right. And then last but certainly not least, related to kind of understanding music, is analyzing interviews and oral histories. So oral histories and interviews sometimes get a bad rap for being unreliable sources, but a good historian knows that all sources are unreliable. So there's no reason that this source material, which is predominantly how women and people of color recorded their histories, it's no more unreliable than any other kind of source. So this way of preserving the past, oral history and interviews, allows us to include people who are left out of traditional documentation methods, and allows us to hear how historical impact shapes memory. So history and memory are different but interrelated concepts. And historical impact, how we understand the historical significance of an event, is related to the intersection of history and memory. So if you're looking for that intersection of history and memory, interviews and oral histories it's one of the best ways to get to that material. So oral history and interviews are a treasure trove of information for understanding historical significance and how historical significance changes over time. So that caveat though, the best practices for oral history and interviews involve something called informed consent. So when someone sits down to interview another person, they have to tell that person what they're using the interview for. They have to explain to them that I'm plan to use your interview as part of my published work on X, and everyone has to agree to that. The interviewer also has to give the interviewee an opportunity to listen to the interview after the recording. And the interviewer must allow the interviewee to remove pieces from the record. We do this so that the interviewee feels safe and comfortable to share their stories with us. These stories, you are not entitled to them. You are not entitled to the stories of your elders or your ancestors. They are a gift and they should be given freely. So sometimes there are going to be topics that are off limits. Respect that choice. These are the stories typically of people who are marginalized. And so it's really important that we are very respectful of the things they do want to tell us. Okay, so all that said, all the caveats, these are some questions to consider when you are looking at an interview or an oral history as a primary source. So who is being interviewed? How are they related to the historical event that I am researching? Who is the interviewer? What are their credentials? Why do they get to be the interviewer? What is the relationship between the interviewee and the interviewer? And identity is key here. So how does the identity of the interviewee and the interviewer shape which stories are told and how? So think about race, class, gender presentation, level of education, language. All these things are super important factors, right? So if you are interviewing the victim of a sexual assault, perhaps, that person might not be comfortable telling their story if the interviewer is of the same gender as the person who assaulted. So it's important to kind of keep those things in mind when you're thinking about the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. And these questions aren't always so grave. Sometimes I'm interviewing my grandmother, right? And so my grandmother might not want to tell me, all the bad things that she did when she was a young girl. She might just not want to tell me that, right? So sometimes maybe you're too close to your subject that you're interviewing. So you want to think about what is being shared And why is it being shared now? What's the occasion for the interview? What questions are being asked and how are they shaping the interviewee's responses? There's something called a leading question, and a leading question kind of forces the interviewee to answer the question a certain way. Leading questions are generally frowned upon in interviews and oral histories, but it happens sometimes. For humans, it happens. So just be aware when you're looking at the questions that you're also looking for leading questions. The best kind of questions are open-ended questions that encourage the interviewee to kind of speak freely. And then finally, you want to think about the circumstances of the interview. Is this happening in someone's private home? Is this happening in public? How does that change what people are or are not willing to share? And perhaps some of the best examples of oral histories are the WPA slave narrative. So the Library of Congress has this huge online collection of related photographs, documents, transcripts, things like that, associated with the Federal Writers Project and the WPA slave narratives. So if you're interested in oral history, you should really check out the WPA slave narratives and think about what is the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. So all of the interviewers worked for the government. All of the interviewees were former enslaved people. So how does that dynamic play out? And how does that shape which stories are or are not told? All right. So that's kind of a crash course and some big questions to think about when you're analyzing primary sources, different kinds of primary sources. So if there's something that we missed, or you're looking for a strategy to analyze a very particular primary source, you can put that in the chat, or you can email us at nhdaz@azhs.gov. And a lot of this is just kind of training wheels, right? Once you kind of get a feel for how to analyze primary sources, you can totally go off script and do it your own way. But you just want to make sure that when you're analyzing primary sources, the biggest question you are answering is, why does it matter? And how does it relate to what I'm trying to argue in my project? All right. And so for the remainder of the fall workshops, we only have a couple workshops left. So next week, there's going to be a workshop on project drafting. We're going to talk about how to revise your thesis statement. We're going to talk about project organization and how to weave your argument throughout your entire project. November 6th is the historical context and student voice info session. So what is historical context? What is student voice? How do I get better at doing both? And then finally, the category specific workshops for whatever project category you're working on for National History Day. So we hope to see you next week, and good luck with your projects. Stop recording.